Welcome, listeners, to a very special episode of Dudes of the Dead podcast. This is a bonus episode in honor of the new Saw 10 film, which just came out this past weekend.
A special bonus.
A special bonus. In addition to watching Saw 10, Leatherface and I have spent the last 2 weeks watching every Saw film. In some cases, I think I watched 3 or 4 of them in a single day. So not only are we going to review Saw 10 for you, but we're also going to give our thoughts on the entire Saw franchise. So we've each watched Saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, Jigsaw, Spiral, and Saw 10 over the last 2 weeks.
Oh, and it's been a long September, I have to say.
It's been a lot of Saw.
A lot of Saw.
So we're going to start. We will avoid major spoilers for the Saw franchise. When we do our Saw 10 review, we will give you our general thoughts, and like always, we will then transition with a spoiler warning. So you can listen to our initial thoughts on the Saw 10 film without spoilers. So
and let's just be fair. This franchise is 20 years old, so there's going to be some spoilers. And if you haven't seen them, then
So you're talking for the franchise, we'll have
the
spoilers.
franchise. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you don't want spoilers, then you need to go watch Saw 1 through 9 before listening to this section.
For sure.
I don't think we intend to spoil major things, but some might slip out.
Yeah.
And we know that Leatherface has a reputation for spoiling films during the non-spoiler sections.
Exactly.
Okay, so do you want to start? What is your overall take on the Saw franchise?
I want to play a game. Most people are so ungrateful to be alive. But not you. Not anymore.
Okay. I'm not going to be popular if you're a Saw franchise fan. I'm not a huge fan of the franchise, but to be fair, I'm not a fan of franchises in general. And my explanation or my caveat about that is, while I love the idea of an ongoing story, I feel that most franchises kind of shit the bed after about 2 movies. The writing gets bad. The stories are sloppy. Sometimes they can't bring stars back. Sometimes the performances aren't as good. Sometimes they just get lazy. And so it's not so much about not enjoying a franchise, but it's more about, I always feel like it's a money grab as opposed to anything else. And it doesn't matter the franchise. I love the original Halloween, but I've crapped on the franchise before. Friday the 13th, I was never a fan. Saw, I was never a fan, and I'll talk a little bit more when we get into the movies. But what I will say about the Saw franchise in particular, and Jay of the Dead brought this up.
And for those who don't know, so Jay of the Dead's New Horror Movies is another horror podcast. We will actually be on Jay of the Dead's New Horror Movies podcast to discuss Saw 10. And stay tuned for a future episode where we have special guests. There's a bit of foreshadowing for you.
So I was listening to a podcast, one of his recent podcasts, because he did the same thing. They actually did a long form review of all the Saw franchise on his horror movie.
Yeah, each film got its own review. Yeah.
So what they mentioned there, and I tend to agree. He said this, and a few of his guests said this as well. What I will say about the Saw franchise is that I feel like the movies are what's the word I'm looking for? There's a continuity of the through line through the films. Unfortunately, there's an inconsistency and an unevenness about the films.
In terms of quality, you mean?
In terms of quality, yeah. But I appreciate the fact that even though the timeline's a bit convoluted and there's a lot of jumping back and forth in time, I feel like there is a through line through the movie. So I give them credit for that.
That's actually kind of unique. Like, it almost felt like watching a season of television. Like, it felt like watching an HBO series because there's so much continuity between the films.
Yes.
Which for a horror franchise, I tend to think of them being fairly in a vacuum. Like, there's Freddy shows up again or Michael Myers shows up again. But in terms of like the plot, it's independent per film.
Yeah. So I mean, to make a long story longer, I'm not a huge fan of the franchise, but I do think it has some strengths. And I'm also not, I mean, I don't think the first one was torture porn. but I think the franchise veered into that as it continued down the line.
I agree.
And I'm not a fan of that.
Right.
So I'm not a gore hound, so that doesn't appeal to me necessarily.
Yeah, so two thoughts on what you've said there.
Yeah.
So first of all, I agree. I haven't actually seen many horror franchises all the way through because I find there's a huge drop in quality after the second or third one. I will say though, for Saw, it does seem like the level of quality is a lot higher than you would expect. For example, a film called Saw 6, which is kind of a torture porn genre film. There's a surprising amount of depth and character and narrative that you get from a film called Saw 6 than I would have anticipated.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair. I think it's fair.
Like, I think for a franchise that's going up to the 8s, the 9s, the 10s, there is a lot more quality in the Saw franchise than you would see perhaps in other horror franchises.
Yeah, we didn't get John Kramer in space, or we didn't get
that could still come, but no.
John Kramer versus whoever, V. Like, we didn't get any of that kind of silliness that we've had in other franchises. So, yeah, I mean, I do think the quality of the writing and the story has changed over time. But interestingly, I won't say anything. I'll wait for this, but there's some continuity from Jigsaw Spiral into 10 that I think helps the story along.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think, though it is torture porn, and they do kind of crank up I like the beginning, the first few films, the traps are kind of basic. They seem like traps a single dude could potentially put together. Yeah. And by Saw 5, 6, 7, you would need like a whole team of engineers and millions of dollars to pull these off. But they have a surprising amount of narrative and character, and it doesn't just devolve into traps, which I was pleasantly surprised by, at least up until 6, I think. Yeah,
I think particularly with John Kramer, Amanda, and Hoffman, there's a lot of story and backstory around, maybe not so much Amanda, we get a little bit, but Hoffman, we have quite a bit of detail about his backstory. Mm-hmm. And then of course the franchise centers around John Kramer. So we have a lot of backstory around him. So yeah, I mean, I do think that there's quite a bit of decent writing. And I like the actor. I mean, he's likably despicable. I like the actor that plays Hoffman.
Yep.
I can't remember his name. And Tobin Bell is great.
Tobin Bell's very good.
Yeah. As John Kramer, I think and I would say maybe even he's gotten better in the role as the films have progressed. If that's possible.
And they flesh out his character more. I think you become more attached to him.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And he sort of transitions from villain to almost anti-hero maybe by the end.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Like his arc, I think, is one of the best parts of the Saw franchise.
Now, so I didn't rank them, but I do have some favorites in the...
Same. I didn't go, I couldn't give you a 1 through 10.
No, ranking, me neither.
But I wonder if our favorites are the same.
So...
What are your top 3?
Okay, so my top 3 are 1, 2, and 6.
Me too.
Yeah.
I think 1, 2, and 6... I think you and I would differ a little bit, maybe between 3, 4, and 5, but I think the quality drops off there a bit.
Yeah, and it's funny because there's some good reviews of 3, and I just couldn't get the through line to see that. It was too convoluted for me.
Yeah,
I was struggling to figure out what was going on, and even though I've seen it twice now, I'm still not convinced that it was as good as some people say it is.
Well, I think that's a warning for the franchise. You have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to put together the storyline. It jumps around with timelines. Yeah. There's multiple timelines. There's multiple characters. Certain films don't resolve until future films, and then future films have flashbacks to previous films.
Totally.
So I agree. I think by the third one, it's kind of hard to follow. And I wonder if it's more rewarding because people seem to like 3, but people who like 3 have seen them multiple times. I could see the third one being better on rewatch because you could maybe put the pieces together a little bit more.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think in their own right, 1, 2, and 6 are very watchable just as single films for your first time through.
And a shout out to people who have, there's a few people online, and I'm sorry, you deserve some credit, and I wish I had written it down, but I apologize. There's a few people on YouTube that have actually gone to the trouble of doing timelines.
Yeah, I watched some of
which
those.
I've watched a couple just to kind of get it straight in my head. And and there's a there's a lot of work
The
that they
timelines alone are like 4 hours long. Like,
Yeah.
you have to,
yeah
there's
you,
a lot to unpack in these.
you
films.
have to and there's I think it's CZ's World or CZ.
That's right. That's
yeah,
what I
okay.
watched, yeah.
So it was like an hour long or something, and he goes back to the birth of John Kramer, which I think might be a bit much, but he does
Born
like
in
50.
1954.
Yeah. He does like 50 years of the Saw timeline or whatever. But those were helpful in giving some context. Particularly, I think I'd seen 1, 2, Jigsaw, and Spiral before, but and maybe 3, I'm not sure, but I hadn't seen definitely 4, 5, 6, or 3D. This 7.
I had not seen much of the franchise either. I think I'd seen 1, 2, and Spiral.
So I think, I think putting it in, having somebody like CZ's World or whatever it's called, and having the timeline really helped me wrap my head around seeing 9 movies this month of the same franchise.
But I'll admit, it was not as bad as I anticipated. I thought the quality would drop off pretty significantly after Saw, and I kept being like, "Oh, I'm kind of excited to watch the next one," or "That was pleasantly surprising," or "The film might start bad, and by the end, I was engaged." Like, I do feel like the quality is pretty high. I feel like it really drops after 6. I did not like 7 or 8 or Spiral as much, but I think the original 1 through 6, even though I think we both think 1, 2, and 6 are the best, 3, 4, and 5 are still pretty good, especially for a 3, a 4, and a 5 in a horror franchise, I think.
Sure. I mean, I liked, well, I thought Jigsaw was pretty good. I didn't mind that. Like, I thought the story was pretty good. It takes a weird jump in time, that one. And it was hard to follow. Okay, is this supposed to be happening before this or after this? And it's funny because on second watch, this was my second watch of Spiral. I was pretty unimpressed the first time I watched it. This time, I don't know it's as bad as a movie as I had initially thought. But what really struck me this time is I just don't think. I think Chris Rock was so poorly cast as the character, and that really ruined the film for me.
That was my issue with Spiral as well. Something about Chris Rock's delivery,
he doesn't do
him
it
as a comedian. Like, I just couldn't take him seriously, and he kind of talks like he normally talks during stand-up.
Yeah,
and it was just a bit weird.
I mean, and I was thinking about, okay, it's not just the fact that he's a comedian, because Robin Williams did that crossover. He did dramatic roles very well,
and horror. 1 Hour Photo.
Yes,
it's actually quite creepy. Yeah.
And Rock, I just don't think has the acting chops to pull it off. And maybe that, or maybe there's something else to it. I mean, Samuel L. Jackson wasn't great in it either. Let's be honest.
But he's being,
but he has
a more minor role too.
Yes, fair. But yeah, it wasn't so much the story that bothered me, and I'm sure I'm sure our many listeners are gonna comment that, I mean, some people don't consider Spiral a Saw film as part of the franchise.
The Book of Saw.
But I will suggest this to you, considering the new release is Saw 10, which one would be number 9? That would have to be Spiral. So at least the makers of Saw consider Spiral as part of the franchise. It's not outside the franchise.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me too that Spiral kind of ends on a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
So I thought it's interesting that I thought the next Saw film would be picking up where Spiral left off. Maybe it didn't do well at the box office and they're just going to drop that. We'll see. But
I just read something about there's been hints dropped about Saw 11.
I think they're going to keep going. Yeah.
I mean, at some point, John Kramer's really going to have to die.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Tobin Bell's 81 now.
Yeah.
And that was, anyway, we'll get into that with Saw 10. Although I think his age isn't an issue in the new one because he's supposed to be in ill health.
That's right.
But there was, I'm sorry. Let's save it. Let's save it for Saw 10. Okay.
But yeah, I think Saw sort of has two audiences. I think there's people who really like just the traps, and if you're in it for the body horror and the torture porn elements, I think that amplifies maybe as the series goes on. But there's also there's some good twists and turns. There's some good drama. And because you have that thread that pieces together 1 through 7, it kind of keeps you wanting to keep watching all the way through because it's one continuous story. My critique with Jigsaw is it felt like they were just looking for an excuse to have another Saw film. It doesn't really fit into the overarching story, and they tried to find ways just to have an excuse to make an eighth one, but it felt maybe kind of unnecessary.
Well, there's something, sorry, I'm just going to jump off because there's something that you had said earlier, which I want to agree with. And that is, I think part of the challenge for me in the middle section of the franchise was the complexity of the traps and the fact that they got to be almost a parody of,
I agree,
of the traps. And for me, that was like, yeah, at the beginning, the first one, arguably, I mean, they're in a trap, but the original Saw was way more about the story than about anything going on with people having to do something.
Totally.
I mean, it gets there, but it takes the whole movie to get there.
Yeah.
Whereas the other ones, you know, kind of sprinkle the traps and stuff all the way through. And then, yeah, like you say, they became so elaborate and so ridiculous.
Like whole facilities with,
yeah,
you would need a literal team of engineers and a lot of money. And I just don't buy that a guy who's dying of cancer, despite having a few minions along for the ride, could put all that together.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's what, I mean, and again, you can just say, well, you just have to suspend your disbelief and enjoy the ride. And that's fair enough.
And the better you are at doing that, the more you're going to enjoy this series.
Absolutely.
If you like to nitpick things and if you care about believability, this will probably be a bad experience for you. Though they do explain, I mean, narratively, they do explain everything.
They do.
But it relies a lot on perfect, like, anticipation of where characters are going to be and anticipation of unfolding events. So it's explained, but maybe not always explained well. Like, it's still a stretch to the way that everything comes together. You're like, really? How did that person know that this person was going to be here at this time?
Exactly.
And, like, those sort of mental gymnastics.
And I think part of the continuity, part of the thing that holds the franchise together is the fact that Kevin, is it Greutert or Greutert?
Greutert, yeah.
So he directed 10, but he also directed 6 and 7, and he was editor for most of them.
Yeah.
So that fact alone gives you some continuity in the film because you have someone who has the franchise firmly in their head and understands what the franchise is doing. And then I think you've got the same writers on Jigsaw, Spiral, and 10. So 8, 9, 10.
Yeah, I think to their credit, it does flow together quite well, all things considered.
Yeah.
Like most horror franchises, they're getting up to like the 10th installment. There's usually a lot of retconning and going back, and things are different, and maybe the first 5 are produced by one company, and the other 5 are produced by other companies, and there's no continuity. These ones all flow together pretty well, and it's like a credit to him, I think, in his editing. The editing is very good. Yeah. And he's conscious, I think, of making sure that everything does make sense. Like, there is an explanation if you go back and watch them again for where everything fits. So you can put everything together, which I think is a strength. And
it makes a huge difference having actors return as well, like having Tobin Bell come back, having Shawnee Smith come back. Apologies, the actor that plays Hoffman, he's back for several films. Like, having the personalities come back instead of having, you know, people change through the film. Because let's just say for the sake of argument that they couldn't get Tobin Bell back and you had a different John Kramer. Well, for me, that would pull you out of the franchise.
Brought in Nicolas Cage or something.
Totally, yeah. I mean, as great a job as he would do, he might not meet the expectation in my head of Tobin Bell. So,
and I think the performances are strong all the way through.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
My main critique, and I think you agree, is that the traps almost, as you say, become a parody of themselves. Like, they're just so elaborate and so ridiculous that maybe some people like that, but if you're there for the story, I think that takes away from it.
Yeah.
But for a film that says Saw 6 or Saw 10, like, the quality is shockingly high, because I don't know if you could say the same for, like, I haven't seen them all, but would Nightmare on Elm Street 7 have the same?
No,
exactly. So for a horror franchise, which is an important qualifier, I think the quality is certainly above average, and I think there's a lot of fun to be had with these if you're willing to.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's fair.
Suspend your disbelief.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, because I was pleasantly surprised. I enjoyed them more than I thought I was going to.
Okay, so is that all we have to say about the franchise part? Like, are we ready to talk about 10?
I think so. I guess just to our listeners or viewers, do you then recommend, what are your recommendations then when it comes to the Saw franchise?
Wow, that's a tough one. And I say a tough one because I'm not particularly a torture porn fan, and that's part of the reason I stopped watching the Saw franchise, to be honest.
Yeah, me too, I think.
I think I may have gotten to 3 and then thought, nah, just isn't doing it for me. 1 and 2, I could get down with. And I don't know why I tried, like I skipped the middle section and I think I picked it up at Jigsaw. Okay, so here's what I'm thinking. If you enjoy, if you're a gore hound or this is your bag, you just really like this style of film, then I think this has a lot going. There's some really crazy kills. The franchise can be a lot of fun. I think that, although the quality is uneven in terms of above average, I think you could do a lot worse in terms of watching a franchise all the way through.
Definitely.
So I think if you like the idea of, and I'm a bit of a sucker for revenge retribution films, and I kind of like that. So if you can kind of get your head around John Kramer's philosophy and ideology around people.
That would be interesting to talk about too. It would involve spoilers, but I have some issues with that too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't always agree that his victims are worthy of being his victims. So all of that to say, if you like this kind of thing, I think you'll have a lot of fun with the franchise, and probably you've watched the franchise already. If you're not, this isn't your thing, then I'd say I would cherry pick. And I would say 1, 2, and 6 would be the ones I would watch, because I think you can watch those as standalones. 1 and 2, I think, are great follow-ups to one another. I think 1's a really strong film. I mean, despite the fact it was made, I just looked this up today. I think they made it for $1.2 million because it's basically one room.
Yeah.
It's like a play. And it grossed 120 million or something like that, or 110 million. The franchise from start to finish has grossed over $1 billion.
I guess that's why they keep making them.
Yeah, with a B. So all of that to say, yeah, if this is your bag, watch the franchise and definitely watch 10 that we'll be talking about in a minute. If it's not really your thing, then 1, 2, and 6, I think will give you enough of a flavor of the franchise.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. I think Saw 1 is the best. I think Saw 1 is excellent. And I think if you watch Saw 1, after you finish that film, that will tell you what you should do with the franchise.
Yeah, good point.
Like if you enjoy Saw 1, you should watch Saw 2.
Yeah.
If you like Saw 2, you should watch Saw 3. If you're struggling through 3, 4, and 5, maybe skip to 6 and then call it a day. But I think you will either be compelled to keep watching or you'll be turned off and you won't.
Totally.
And yeah, if you are very upset or you struggle with gore, then you're probably not going to like this series, hands down. But if you can handle gore, there's more to this than just torture porn gore fest. Like there is some good narrative twists and some good characterization. And I think, start with 1 and you'll see where you go.
For sure. There. Yeah, that's a great caveat. I think if you're on the sensitive side and you like maybe being scared more than the body horror aspect of it, then I'd give it a pass. If you enjoy the body horror kind of stuff, then you'll probably like, most of the kills. Or if you like stuff like Friday the 13th, we get to see, somebody's, decapitated or disemboweled or whatever, then you'll probably love Saw. But if you're sensitive to that and it's like, if you're a little bit squeamish, and I have to admit, there were times in the films where I was like, I don't know if I can watch any, especially because
Maybe don't watch them all in one weekend.
I was going to say, I didn't do the marathon that you did. I was watching like one every few days or, every 3 or 4 days. But even at that, it's like, I remember getting to around 5 and 6 and thinking, I don't know how much more of this. I wasn't sure I could make it through the franchise. Quite a lot. And I just kind of powered through and found my second wind. But, and a shout out too, because I don't think I would have done that if I wanted to give, because I'm a bit nervous about being on Jay's podcast today. I wanted to give due consideration to being a guest on somebody's podcast, and I felt obligated to do my homework. And I felt like if he extended an invitation that it was incumbent upon me to do my research and my homework. I would never have agreed to go on if I wasn't willing, to do the work. So Jay, if you're listening to the podcast, which is unlikely, considering how busy you are, I did it all for you. So there you go.
Yeah, and I'll second that. But I do think that some people might write this series off because they think of it as just torture porn. And for those people, I would say I think it's worth trying because I think there is more to it than just that. And I could see, like I did, I didn't really go forward with the series because I wrongly assumed that Saw 3 through 7 was just going to be all traps and all torture porn and no story. And there's a lot more there. So if you're someone who hasn't given the series a chance because you were wary of that fact, I think it's worth trying to give it a shot.
I fall into that boat. I basically had written the series off thinking it was going to be like Hostel.
Yeah.
And it's got a lot more meat to it, no pun intended, than Hostel. Like, I mean, Hostel's a throwaway, that franchise 1, 2, 3. I don't even know if there's a fourth one, but I didn't watch past one. It was like there was not much to it beyond the body horror.
I think it operates as a black comedy, but that's a story for
another day. Fair enough.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I enjoyed the Saw franchise more than I thought I would. So maybe check it out.
Me too. I agree.
All right.
I agree.
Well, all that being said, should we jump into Saw 10?
Saw 10, or as some people are calling it, Saw X. I'm pretty sure it's 10, but I could be mistaken.
Yeah, whatever you like.
Yeah.
Okay, so a synopsis, and this is some brief spoilers. A sick and desperate John travels to Mexico for a risky and experimental medical procedure in hopes of a miracle cure for his cancer, only to discover the entire operation is a scam to defraud the most vulnerable.
Of all the men to cheat, you picked John Kramer?
I still have a lot of work that needs to be done.
X is getting a 7.3 on Internet Movie Database, has an 85% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, and a 92% audience score. Now, bear in mind, this is only a few days after the film has come out, so these may change over time. But these are very high scores for the 10th iteration of a horror franchise. This was directed by Kevin Grudert. As Lee mentioned earlier, this was the same director as Saw 6 and Saw 7, and stars Tobin Bell as John Kramer. So I'm curious to hear first what your expectations for this film were. I went in completely blind. I did not even watch the trailer. And I think given that this was the 10th film in a horror franchise, I had quite low expectations.
Agreed.
Though I knew it was the director of 6 and I liked 6, but it was also the director of 7 and I hated 7. So I was really, I had fairly low expectations. I wasn't quite sure how this would go. But yeah, what would you think when you sat down just about to watch this?
Pretty much in the same boat. I mean, I'd heard good buzz, but I did exactly the same thing. Other than seeing the poster, I avoided, and I was like, oh, what's that going on? That was anyway, we'll get there. Yeah, I avoided watching any trailers. I had very low expectations going in, especially after Spiral, because I just thought, oh, that was just such a shit show.
Mm-hmm. Fortunately, Chris Rock is not in this film.
Yes, fortunately for everybody. But I was pleasantly surprised. And I think you saw this 2 nights ago, Friday night. We're on Sunday afternoon.
That's right. Yeah, I saw it Friday. You saw it
I saw it Saturday night. And it was a pretty decent, like it was a full theater. It was a good crowd.
We only had 10 or so when I was there, but I went in the afternoon. So.
Okay. Yeah. It was a full, like I went to the 7 p.m. show and it was a full crowd.
Oh, cool.
So that was good. Yeah, I really liked, now, so this is Saw 10. It could be called Saw 1.5 because in the timeline, it takes place between Saw 1 and 2, right?
Yeah.
So I really like, and I know a couple of reviewers have commented on this. Right away, I liked the cinematography, the look of the film, and it really reminded me of the early Saw films. The grittiness and the color scheme of the film reminded me of the first two.
Agreed, but I felt this almost had a more broad color palette, like it actually was kind of light, and I wrote it feels like a real movie, meaning I feel like the whole Saw franchise is so like dark and dingy and that kind of blue light, whereas this had a more, I think would have more broad cinematic appeal.
Agreed. I mean, this definitely had a broader base for the story. I mean, you actually got out of one building or from the police headquarters to one building.
This one even has some sunlight in it.
I know.
You don't experience it all in the first time.
Yeah, like I mean, you're in a city cafe at one point, and John Kramer's talking to somebody, and you actually see a sunrise at the end of the film, and so for sure, it's got I think a broader
it felt
appeal.
higher budget to me.
Absolutely higher budget, and it felt like to me, this felt I like how you've articulated that. I feel like rather than a genre film, it felt more like a real movie, quote unquote, within a genre.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I don't know if I'm articulating that very well, but it felt pretty good. Like I thought it was a good film. And I've said to you, I'm on the fence about whether this is edging out my love of the first film.
Mm-hmm.
I have some issues with this one, but I think in terms of the writing and the performances and the story, I'm almost leaning towards liking this one as the best one in the franchise.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if I'd put it above 1, but I think it's in the top 3. Like it's right up there.
100%.
Maybe even better than 2 and 6.
Yeah.
I like, because I think we both agree that as the series goes on, it's more about over the top, elaborate, ridiculous traps, maybe more emphasis on traps, less emphasis on story and character. This one, you almost have no traditional Saw elements for almost the first half of the film.
Yeah.
Like this is very character focused, very narrative driven. And I like that they have John Kramer or Tobin Bell as the subject of the film, and they focus on him for the first half of the film. And I almost was it felt like I was watching a normal movie. For
exactly.
Like it didn't have those Saw elements, which I liked. I thought that was refreshing. That's what I wanted to see.
Yeah.
And I didn't necessarily think they would do that. And so I was pleasantly surprised that I know we argue about the term elevated horror, but this felt elevated above the rest of the Saw franchise, I thought.
I agree. And I think the other thing that does for me is it creates a scenario. Not only am I invested more in Kramer as a character, John Kramer, but it creates a scenario where I'm on his side in the second half of the film. It's like, and I would argue that for this film, his, he wouldn't call it revenge. I think he calls it retribution.
Right.
Every character is deserving of the fate that he's chosen for them. So I feel like they took the time to set that up in the first half and get you invested in who John Kramer is and the situation that he's in. So that makes the payoff for me a lot tastier with all the characters.
Yeah, I think you and I would agree that whether certain individuals throughout the Saw franchise are deserving of the horrible fates they get is questionable.
Yeah.
I think in this case, for the most part, you're pretty on board with what's happening to these people. And they situate, because normally Jigsaw's kind of the villain, but in this case, the bad guys are like almost more despicable than him.
Yeah.
So it pushes him into like full-on anti-hero territory, which he flirts with, but I don't ever quite get there. But I think in this case, he kind of gets there.
Yeah. And they also play with the idea of, I mean, you can agree or disagree with his moral view of the universe, but he definitely has an antagonist who doesn't really have any morality. So that stands him in good stead, because at least he has some morality, as skewed as it might be. And so, yeah, I just feel like it was really well done. Like I was like really pleasantly surprised. As you already mentioned, that first half of the film where it's like, wow, there hasn't been, other than that one episode,
which we'll talk about in the spoiler section,
where he's envisioning something, but that's just kind of a teaser, a taster. But really, the first half is investing you in what's going to come.
Totally. And I think the traps as well, we won't spoil what they are, but I like that as they got more over the top and elaborate throughout the franchise, this one they kind of return back to that more simplistic nature.
Agreed.
For the most part. But they're also some of the most, in my mind, like I was squirming hard.
Oh. Like
they are hard to watch, I thought. Like of all the ones in the franchise, I think these are some of the hardest ones to watch. And looking around the theater too, there were people who this was the only time I think I've seen a Saw film in theaters. But it was kind of fun looking around the room and watching other people squirm, because all the other Saw films I think I saw at home, Was this your first Saw experience in theater?
It was my first in theaters. Yeah.
And what did you read from the audience when, some of these traps are occurring to the...
Well, I mean, we've talked about, sort of audience, the degradation of audience behavior over time. I found the audience really respectful. And other than I was complaining to Mike about, the person sitting beside me, in the theater, who was...
Me. Well, at least it didn't ruin your overall experience of the film.
No, it was a good. So coming back, I was kind of sitting off to the side, so I wasn't too close to the person beside me, and I didn't really pay attention to people's reactions, of course, because although everybody's in front of me, I can only see the back of chairs, but you could feel the tension in the room, and it was fairly quiet, fairly attentive. Like people were paying attention to what was going on for sure.
Yeah, the audience was very engaged during my showing as well.
Yeah.
But I could see people, maybe because it wasn't full, like in their seats recoiling and squirming and covering their eyes. Some of these are...
I'll be interested to know if your cringe one was the same cringe one as mine, but we'll get there.
Yeah, I'm sure it's somewhat individualistic in terms of what people find off-putting or terrifying, but yeah. So... yeah, it's interesting. I think I agree with you. If I was just to rate the overall quality of this film, it might be the best one.
Right.
With the budget and with the performances and with the emphasis on story. I think it's on par with one.
Agreed.
But that's pretty incredible for like the 10th installment in a franchise to be considered maybe even better than the original. Like I would say that almost never happens. I would struggle to think of another franchise where that is the case.
Yeah, I can't think of anything that has put out that many films where the quality definitely varied, as we've talked about, but the 10th one in the franchise being nearly equal, in some people's minds better than the original. Yeah, I can't. There's not one. I challenge you, listener. Tell us one that's better.
Jason in Space?
Maybe.
So, yeah, I think that's pretty incredible. And part of that might be I did have lower expectations, so I was pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
But when you read the critic reviews, I mean, what was it?
92 or something?
92 audience score, 85% critic score. This is for the 10th installment in a horror franchise. That is incredible.
And a body horror, torture porn franchise. I know some people don't like that terminology.
I think your average moviegoer would just kind of look down on a franchise like Saw. And that's where I think it does exceed expectations.
And I think, I mean, coming back to something you said in the first part before we got into the review of this, I probably would not have seen this in theaters if I hadn't spent the time watching the franchise.
I know I would not have. I probably wouldn't have even watched it.
Because my expectations would have been that it's just the same as the other 9 or 8 if you discount one as being the best.
Yeah.
So, yeah, complete pleasant surprise. And I think credit to the creative team involved, the writers, the editors, the directors. I know Kevin Gruder was doing double duty as editor and director on this one.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that he's been there the whole time, and like he clearly has, I think this is the thing, like by the 10th installment, usually it's not about a love for the subject matter. It's about, can we just make more money and milk a franchise? Where in this case, you get the sense there's still some passion and some love for this franchise and John Kramer as a character, and they have a story to tell. It's not just, can we come up with a storyline so we can get some butts and seats to sell tickets?
Yeah, agreed.
Which is pretty cool. And even there's some comedy in this film.
Yes.
Which I don't think I really noticed throughout the franchise a whole lot.
No. I mean, if anything, there might be the odd bit of black comedy, but it's rare.
So I enjoyed some of not a lot of comedy, and they play it straight, but some of the lines, like there's one about him having hobbies or something. He kind of jokes about his hobbies, and that got a laugh in the theater.
Yeah, for sure.
Which was cool, because I think, this one just is a little more dynamic and a little more well-rounded. And I don't like that I'm saying it's like a real movie, but the Saw franchise has a certain aesthetic and a certain tone. It feels a bit homogenous, but this one feels a little more rich, even just like an expanded color palette and maybe like fleshing out characters a little bit more. Yeah, I think it's a very good film.
Yeah, me too. And I think credit again to the creative team involved in the film, that not only in terms of quality is it a throwback to the first Saw film, but the aesthetic of the film, the simpler, for the most part, the simpler traps, the visual aesthetic of the film, the color palette, although it's expanded a little bit, but the grittiness, the graininess of the film, that's all throwback. And in time, it's supposed to be between 1 and 2.
Yeah.
So I think there was a lot of care to not only create a good film, but create a film that fit into the timeline where it was supposed to fit into the timeline, visually, aesthetically, all those things. And I mean, as a moviegoer, I appreciate that because that allows me to immerse myself in the film and think, okay, somebody behind the scenes is thinking about me as a viewer and wanting me to have a good experience when I get in there. So yeah, kudos.
And I think it elevates the character, like to see John Kramer just sitting at a cafe having coffee in the daylight.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like, yeah, that's something we would picture like Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter. Like you see him out in public doing normal human things and you realize there's more to this character than just some dude who sits in his basement devising traps and torturing people. Like it humanizes him, makes him into a real person, a real character who, just goes to grab a coffee at his local coffee shop. Like I like that it enriched John Kramer as a character, even though that's a very minor thing. I don't think we've seen that once throughout the entire franchise. It's always him. It's always narrative driven, or it's just him in his dingy dark basement doing.
And again, I mean that sets for the most part sets this franchise apart from the Freddy Kruegers, the Michael Myers, the Jasons. Who, I mean, those characters.
I've never seen Freddy go for coffee.
Exactly. I mean, there may have been attempts with Michael Myers to humanize him in certain ones, but for the most part, he's evil incarnate, right? And that's not. I've got that exactly in my notes. This film humanizes John Kramer. Yeah. And again, like whether you buy into his philosophy around how he's going to help people. I think that was one of the funny lines. I think it's one of the main doctor says, "Oh, are you a life coach?"
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
He's like, "Yes,
as life coach."
Something like that.
That was it. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so many good things to say about this film, but I'm curious if you had were there any niggles for you in the film?
I do, but I think they're all spoilers, so we might have to hold off.
Okay.
On those.
So maybe before we go into spoilers, then, so it sounds like for you, this is a recommend?
Absolutely. And I wonder if they made a mistake calling this Saw X or Saw 10, because I think if you hadn't watched the series, why would you go see Saw 10 if you've not seen Saw 4 and Saw 5 and Saw 6? I wonder if they should have chosen a name more like a Jigsaw or more like a Spiral, because I think this does stand on its own better than most in the series. And I do think it's one of the best in the series. And I think, like you and I wasn't even going to go see it because I wasn't into that franchise. So I wonder if they should have called this something else, just to draw in people who don't feel like maybe they need to feel that they have seen the entire series to watch this. But I do think if you're watching this and you're not a Saw fan, you should go see this. It does stand on its own very well. Granted, it maybe gains a little bit if you've seen the series because you have more attachment to John Kramer's character.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of good stuff here. Just as a horror film to watch in the month of October leading up to Halloween, I think this is a good one.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, again, if you want to try to watch, I would say if you have even just the background of 1 and 2,
for sure,
then that'll put a little bit more context into this one for you because you'll understand a bit more about Amanda as a character. But even if you don't have that, I agree. It's a standalone. You can go watch it and there'll be a couple of things where you go, there's some logic that's not connecting for me that you probably would have if you'd seen 1 and 2. But if I would say, yeah, for sure, you could go watch this.
Yeah, this exceeded every expectation that I have. And my critiques are actually more nitpicks and more to do with like the world of Saw and not so much the film itself. I think I have actually very few critiques of the film itself.
I mean, before we get into spoilers, I just want to say that if you can hear the lawnmower, we are Sunday afternoon. I'm going to have to set a trap for my neighbor. And I'll, now that I've watched all 9 movies, I'm sure I can come up with it.
This is the thing, when you watch 10 Saw films in 2 weeks, I'm like making chicken and like the Saw theme's playing on my head. Like, let's play a game, like put it in the oven. And yeah, it's It's not healthy. I definitely need a break from these.
Yeah,
stuff.
I need a break from these films as well.
Your poor neighbor.
Okay, so are we going to spoilers?
Spoilers.
Okay.
So this is a recommend for both of us.
It's a total recommend. Yeah, I'd
Right.
say like run out and see it.
See it in theaters.
Yeah, see it in theaters because it's a fun film to see in theaters. I think it deserves.
Do
to
a
be
mini
seen.
version of what we did. Just watch Saw 1 and 2 on Netflix.
Yeah.
They're on there right now, and then you can go watch.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
Yeah, so 100% go watch.
Spoilers.
Spoilers are okay.
So I just had an upcoming thing spoiled for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
First one. Or do you want to go?
No, I was just I'm curious about I wanted to just jump back to your cringes. Which scene?
yeah. Okay, so the one that really got me, and I don't know why, but it was the one where she had to saw off her leg
Me too.
and then drain the bone marrow.
Oh,
And I don't know
that
what it is about
was-
bone marrow, but I was like almost borderline feeling sick. That was really gross.
That was like it, and it wasn't so much. Although her sawing her own leg off was part of it, but then sticking that hose thing
That's the part that
into her
really
femur,
grossed
it's
me
like,
out.
oh my god,
So is that the worst for you as well?
that was the worst one. I actually really liked the eye pop. That I thought was really good.
Yeah, we'll get to that one.
Anyway,
For
go-
the bone marrow, and this is where I call bullshit on John Kramer, and he's like, they have to show the will to live. Like, she showed the
Totally.
will to live. Like, if I were him, I would have given her like a 20-second extension. She was like
Yeah.
almost there, and she died. So like, she was a champ. She did not deserve to die. That
Yeah.
was nasty. And I
Yeah.
thought, okay, this is where your morality makes no sense. Like, she was for sure showing the desire. She was a champ. She sawed off her leg. She
Yeah,
was sucking out
I
the bone
agree.
marrow. She missed it by a hair, and then she dies. Like, that is not fair.
I've often thought. So I'll just back up a step. She was deserving to be in the situation that she was in.
Yes.
However, I've often thought throughout the franchise, it was the time limit.
Yeah.
It's like you're giving somebody 3 minutes, like they need to catch their breath before they saw the rest of their arm off, or whatever the scenario is. That's been a niggle for me through many of the films. Is not so much they didn't deserve to be there in the first place, but they did show a will to live and a willingness to go to the extreme,
Which is important because that's his message. Like, it is a nitpick, but on the other hand, the timed element,
yeah.
like, he's wanting to reform people. He's wanting people to go through these horrific experiences to show they want to live. And when they do that and you kill them anyways, I think it takes away from like his message or
Yes.
his mission, whatever
Yeah.
that is.
Here we are talking very seriously about John Kramer's philosophy and how maybe there's some logical inconsistency in his philosophy.
Speaking of which,
Yes.
that's my other issue. So, Carlos, is this the kid?
Yes.
So in this film, he's like, there's a thing where a kid gets involved and he gets subjected to traps. And here's Kramer all of a sudden really caring about kids and like, oh yeah, I don't do things
Mhm.
to kids. But I'm sorry, in Saw 1, you captured Dr. Gordon's daughter and were ordered to kill her if he didn't complete his trap. And in Saw 3, the main guy whose son is killed, he abducts his daughter and like puts her in a cage. Like, I feel like that's kind of an inconsistency. I don't necessarily feel like he has shown much compassion for kids. This idea that all of a sudden he really doesn't want to do anything to a kid. Did you notice that at all? Do you agree with that?
That's interesting. I hadn't considered that in the timeline. I guess I felt like because he had connected with this kid, there's a scene where he
Because
helps.
he had a personal.
Yes, a personal
I
connection.
mean, it was a 2-second conversation. Though.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not suggesting that excuses all of that
Right.
inconsistency. I'm just saying, to me, that was their explanation for it, right?
Because I do feel like they really try to push him into the anti-hero territory.
Yeah.
And I just don't know if he was quite deserving of it or if that was consistent. Because you were totally prepared to kill off Gordon's daughter.
Yes.
Just the previous film. So why all of a sudden are kids like off limits in this case?
I mean, that's related to one of my niggles, which was the end of the film.
Yes. Yes. Okay. I have one there too. We'll see if it's the
And
same.
so, I mean, for me, it's related because the kid comes in at the end of the film, the last, act of the film. But the very end, you've got a sunrise, you've got Amanda hugging the kid, and I think John Kramer maybe tussles his hair, and I'm just like, oh, for fuck's sake.
As he goes off
Yeah.
to design more traps and put people in like torture. Yeah.
I just
agree.
thought that was so cheesy and like lame as the end of this film.
That's what I mean. Like the color palette and the brightness and the sunshine, like that was very inconsistent with the rest of it.
I mean, I recognize maybe how this is going to make me sound, but it was like, don't make this hopeful. That's not even part of this franchise.
That's the thing. I think it's not that you hate hope. I think it's
Yeah.
it does seem very out of sync with the
Totally.
tone of the franchise.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it doesn't fit with the tone at all. And I mean, I've got some minor niggles, but my other more major niggle was, and I mean, I'm a bit of a broken record on this one. It didn't need to be 2 hours. It could have been a 90-minute film. There was a lot of fluff in that last bit of the film where the twist happens.
That's true.
That
I was
did-
going to push back and say, like, I think the strength of this film, though, is that it takes so much time to set up the character.
I'm thinking more the last twist.
Yeah.
They really stretched that out, and that could have been curtailed, I think.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, I'll give you that.
So maybe not half an hour cut from the film, but it definitely didn't need to be the runtime that it was, and I think it could have been a tighter edit.
Did it feel long to you, though?
No.
Okay, yeah, like I was so engaged, I was never thinking like, oh man, this is dragging on and this is feeling long.
No, until the twist at the towards the very end,
Right.
And then I just thought, this is really getting drawn out. And I mean, as an audience goer and having watched all 9 of the other films, I thought, okay, well, I know this isn't going to end for him here.
You didn't want any more minutes of Saw in your life. Absolutely necessary after 12 hours of Saw films.
I mean, and I knew, or at least I felt fairly confident that that Kramer had in some way gotten rid of the bullets or done. I knew that he knew he was in no danger. However, he still takes a risk.
Yeah, that seemed ridiculous to me a little bit. Like the guy comes in, what's his name? Parker, the guy who.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So he comes in and they clobber him.
Yeah.
So why not then just hook him up to then you've got him.
Yeah.
Set up why risk playing along with this game and putting yourself at risk? Like that whole part to me kind of fell apart. The guy
and risking the child because he had no guarantee that his scheme was going to work out.
Yeah.
Like that. Risk yourself and risk Amanda. Okay. Yeah. You've made the choices to be there. The child hadn't made the choice to be there. And I mean, okay, it wasn't as gruesome as some of the other ones, but it was a pretty nasty trap that they were in.
Yeah. And people said he knew that he was going to be in that trap, and so he made one that was less lethal. That's where I struggle with the franchise sometimes, is this confluence of events that all magically come together that seem really
coincidence is pretty high.
Even if you're super intelligent, your ability to perfectly anticipate all these moving targets and all these different factors and individual people, that kind of fell apart. The film worked for me all the way until that point, and it kind of crumbled.
And that comes back to what we said earlier, though. You kind of you have to suspend your disbelief in some of these things. Because in some of the scenarios, literally, if you were a few feet away, it would have been a completely different outcome. Yeah. So you just kind of have to let that go and say, okay, it is what it is, right?
But then I still once they're in the room together and the music starts playing.
Yeah.
I got the dopamine rush. I had the smile on my face.
Totally.
Okay, I'm loving this, even though it doesn't really make much sense. So it does kind of work, even though if you think about it too hard, maybe it doesn't work.
I know my neighbors don't listen to this, but is there a football field that I'm not aware of that you're mowing right now?
We mow the lawn in October anyways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my lawn does need a mow, but anyway.
I don't have a lawn.
No, okay. So this is a minor niggle, and this has got nothing to do with the actors involved. This has more to do with a recent trend, let's say, in filmmaking, and that is the de-aging of one of the. So it's been however long it's been, 20 years almost. I think the first one was 2004, so it's almost 19 years. So Shawnee Smith, obviously, like all of us, has aged 19 or 20 years. Did you find that there was something funky?
She looked a bit off.
Yeah, okay. Because that kind of took me out of the film a little bit. And that's what I said earlier about like Tobin Bell obviously is 20 years older as well, but because he's supposed to be infirm and cancer ridden, it kind of works,
Yeah.
right? But it doesn't work for her character because whatever, and I know this has been a criticism of quite a few films that have used this technology where you're trying to, I think it was The Irishman, there was a lot of talk about this, although I haven't.
Indiana Jones, if you see
Yeah. So same idea is like they're just they've used AI or whatever to try to de-age these characters, and they just look ridiculous.
I agree. However,
Okay.
I prefer that to them recasting somebody else, and I'm kind of willing to let it slide because I get like people age. That's a very difficult thing to deal with. I did notice it, and it was a little distracting. But on the other hand, I would rather them get the original cast member back.
Yeah,
do that than
fair.
recast somebody else. But you're right; it is distracting.
Yeah, I mean that was the only, like I said, that's a minor niggle for me because I mean I still think that they had the original actor and all that kind of stuff, so that was great. Just took me out of it a bit.
Eyeballs.
Yes.
So did it? So on the one hand, so the eyeball trap, which is like the whole marketing
Yes.
thrust of this film, ends up just being like a dream sequence or a fantasy.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I liked the character development that we get, that John Kramer like spends his day like looking around for people who are maybe doing bad things
Yeah.
and fantasizing up these like traps that he's going to put them in. Even
Like
if
we
they're
all
not gonna
do.
win. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like you do. For the neighbor out there who's mowing his lawn, you're like sitting there thinking what you're going to do with this guy. But hopefully your neighbor doesn't listen to this podcast. So on the one hand, I liked that it developed his character, that we get the sense that he actually spends a lot of his day like fantasizing about these ideas for traps. Did it seem cheap though that the way that they've marketed this, like the eyeball trap is like, this is the signature trap we're going to sell this movie on, ends up not even being an actual thing?
Not for me.
So you didn't think it felt cheap to do that?
No.
Okay. I thought I liked it on the one hand, but then I was also like, maybe you should have picked another. Maybe you should have actually done that trap if you're going to sell the whole movie on it.
Well, I mean, they do it.
They do
It's
it.
It's a dream sequence, but they do it, and we get to see it. And I love the popping eyeballs. I thought that was great. And
That's fair.
I mean, I didn't cringe as much as with the leg, but the breaking fingers that always. I have there's certain scenes in certain movies like the original. Why am I blanking on this? Oh God, I hate this. Getting old. Harrison Ford, but not Indiana Jones. No.
Fugitive?
No, in the future. Well, why can't
Blade Runner.
God damn it. I've seen that movie I don't know how many times.
Sorry. Yeah, Blade Runner.
Fuck. Anyway, Blade Runner at the end where his fingers are broken.
Right.
Like there are just certain movies and breaking fingers for some reason really gets to me. Not as much as sawing your own leg off.
I've never seen draining bone marrow on a film before, but that was really gross. Like catching it on the spoon thing. I was like, oh, that's gross. The thing too, like that guy who's supposed to carve out the explosives from his forearms.
Yeah, I didn't really get how that was embedded in his arm because how would you is it just under the skin and through the muscle? I know he had to cut through muscle.
Yeah, but then how would you not bleed to death? Like the idea that you're going to live after you do that, you've just like carved out both your forearms. That seems like you just bleed out after that anyways.
Well, maybe there aren't a lot of, it's not like your femur. You've got a femoral.
People like cut their forearms and anyway.
But wasn't it on the upper side?
Perhaps.
I don't know if it was on this side. I thought it was on the upper side.
Okay, maybe.
So there's no main artery in there.
That was pretty gross too.
Yeah, that was pretty bad.
Yeah, I squirmed more with these ones than some of the other ones.
Yeah, it's funny because in hindsight, like when I think is it 3 where you've got the one in the house?
They all blend together.
And Amanda Shawnee Smith is in that, or maybe it's 2.
The Needles?
The Needles.
That's the grossest one almost in the whole franchise for me.
That was the one where I'm like, okay, I'm not watching any more of these films. Like that one actually like just made my skin crawl.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was just me because some of them seem so much worse. But that's something about like a pit full of used needles is just really gross.
Like you've got all the saw traps and all these different ones, and it's like falling into a pit of used needles that really gives me the willies.
Well, especially because the guy who's supposed to go in, he throws her in.
Yes.
too, which was just like she's being victimized
Yeah.
even more so there. Yeah.
Um,
Okay, so here's a question for
Okay.
you. Who was the most despicable character in this film?
the Doctor, 100% for me.
Exactly. So I feel like she got off so easy, and that actually kind of bothered me
Yeah.
because like Valentina and Gabriella, who are like, they're still underlings. Like I feel like the mastermind, the most evil character was it Cecilia? Dr. Cecilia Peterson. And so she, A, is still alive at the end of the movie as far as we know.
Yeah.
And B, her trap was the most tame of all the ones in the film. I would have liked to see her be subjected to one of the more like brutal traps.
Yeah, I like Gabriella, I thought with the radiation one, like she's hanging by an arm and a leg. She's chained, and the radiation machine turns on, is basically melting her skin away.
It's pretty gross.
And she's got to break her ankle and her wrist to get out of this thing. And yeah, Peterson at the end of the film, I was waiting for her head to be clamped or like chopped off or something. I'm like, okay, anytime now we can cut her head off. But none of that happened. She's just there.
So do you read that as they want to use her for future films?
Well, okay, here's my niggle with that. So Parker, his like, it's supposed to be chemical gas.
Yeah, she would still be melting,
Yeah.
right? Even though her head, she can breathe.
Her skin, like his skin was all melting away, and it's like mustard gas kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So in theory, sure, from the neck up, she'd be able to breathe, and she doesn't, her skin's not going to be, melting. But the rest of her would be melting down to bone, would it not?
Yep. But they didn't show any of that.
No, they didn't. I mean, I guess. And the other thing is, even
Like
if that,
as an audience member, the person you want to see
Yes.
get it the most is her, yet you are kind of robbed of that compared
Yeah,
to
I
everyone
agree.
else. Especially Gabriella, like they kind of because they have Amanda sympathize with her.
yes,
Yeah, I was a bit disappointed. I thought at some point Amanda might rebel against Kramer
yeah,
on her behalf, and there might be some tension there. I kind of thought that would be a cool thing to include, and they kind of never went there.
although I agree with you, except for the timeline of this film, because Amanda does rebel in 2 and 3,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like where
Do you think this is like planting that seed? a
I
little
think
bit?
so. I felt like they were thoughtful about how they dealt with Amanda's character, because arguably, if Amanda had already rebelled at this point, which is between 1 and 2, she wouldn't have been following guidelines later. And we know from subsequent films that she went back into the bathroom and, for lack of a better word, did a mercy killing on the guy, Lee Whannell's character in the first one. I can't remember his name. And then she also shoots the doctor
Mhm.
in 3, I think it is.
Yeah.
So she does rebel, and Tobin or John Kramer does say to her in 3, like, that was your test.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah, I guess I just thought because she kind of was talking to Gabrielle a little
Totally.
bit, connecting with her. I thought
Totally.
when it was time for her trap, it might be neat to see Amanda push back a little bit or try to appeal to save her or something. It didn't happen, which is
They-
fine. But
and they
maybe
were-
they're planting a seed for future films.
They were definitely questioning his rationale and his morality, I think, by having Amanda's character question him, because she's like, well, not everybody has, like, he talks about, for example, so this is around the idea of drug addiction, which is where Amanda's character comes from. And John Kramer says, well, it's all free will, it's all choice.
Mm.
And that isn't true necessarily. Like if
Yeah.
you're addicted to a substance, where is choice involved in that? Like I don't
For
know.
sure, yeah. There's some interesting, like Sam Harris does a whole series of talks on how humans don't actually have free will. I was actually thinking about that during that phase. But yeah, I think his whole sense of morality is very flawed. I guess it's supposed to be, though, maybe.
Sure. I mean, he's human, right? Like,
Yeah, maybe he comes like more corrupted by his god complex. But this idea that like Jigsaw never, like, how many cops does he kill? Like, they're
Yeah.
innocent, or like
Yeah.
police who are going after him, he kills them. Again, like capturing Dr. Gordon's family and the idea that they could have died, like they're innocent, or capturing people's kids, like, and the ridiculous time limits he gives to people.
yeah.
I would have maybe liked the franchise a little bit more if he did have a stricter moral code that he stuck to. and the fact that he seems to contradict it all the time.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what they were going for. I can't tell if that's like a flaw on the people who designed his character and they are lapsing in their logic, or if he is meant to be a flawed person who doesn't stick to his own code. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe it's like you said, it blurs altogether.
Really does.
Maybe it's 4, but the insurance guy and his sister and somebody, like one of the guys that he rejected, his wife and his son end up in a trap as well.
That's
And it's
right.
like, I just, there's definitely some inconsistent logic.
This idea that he's never killed anyone, I don't really buy that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I'm sure he's telling himself that he's had hands off.
Right. And I'm okay with that. If the idea that he's like a corrupted God complex like figure,
Sure,
that's fine.
sure.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of holes in his code.
But having said all that, those are like, for me, even the ending being a bit too cheesy for me. That's the only time I felt that throughout the entire film. It's like, that doesn't really fit for me. It doesn't sit right as part of the Saw franchise.
Agreed. Did you struggle as well? So when Cecilia like stomps on Gabriella's neck and she's like, oh yeah, as they were dying, all I was thinking is like, oh yeah, it's less people to share the money with. But she was hardcore, like coaching them on and trying to root for them and get them to survive through their traps. So part of me, this is a nitpick again, but I think it didn't make sense to me that she was really trying to coach them through surviving the traps. Like, no, you can do it. Like, do this and do that. And you got this. If she really just wanted them to die. I thought that was a bit of flawed logic.
Yeah. I mean, I see the flaw when you point it out that way. I just...
That's a niggle.
Yeah. I'm not sure I have an explanation for it. She was pretty despicable.
It's fair. But then she did get the
I
comeuppance I was
know.
hoping for.
I know.
But yeah, all being said, I think that's it for spoiler-related things that I wanted to discuss.
Yeah, me too.
Neither of us, we both made the mistake of not sticking around till after the credits.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we won't spoil that for people who want to do it.
Except to say that you should stick through the credits.
Stick around through the credits, yeah.
This isn't a franchise that's known for those post-credit sequences, but there is a character and a scenario that we haven't talked about. So stick around for the credits. We both
almost
missed it.
always do too.
I know,
like,
me
the
too.
Saw films, they don't do that, so I'm
me
going to
too.
leave. And then sure enough, they did one. So, so yeah, I think all things considered, this is one of the best entries in the Saw franchise. It does stand alone very well on its own, so I recommend you go see it in theaters.
Agreed. Definitely go see it in theaters. And if you have the stomach for it, go back or maybe see 1 and 2 before you see this one. But for sure, see this one. If you're going to see any of them, 1 and 10, like bookends, are well worth seeing, I think.
And before we wrap this, we alluded to earlier, so we will be on Jay of the Dead's new horror movies. He's done a breakdown of all the Saw films all the way up till 10, and we will be joining him and the Horror Avengers for a breakdown of Saw 10 reviews. So if you'd like to hear more of our thoughts on Saw X or Saw 10, that should hopefully be out in the next week or two, and you can check it out there.
And if you haven't listened to Jay's rundown of the franchise, they have some really good discussion. Like, they're not all on the same page. There's some really heated discussion in some of those episodes about which franchise is better, who likes what. And so there's some very interesting conversation around, it's a very diverse conversation around the Saw franchise and who likes what and which one's better and all that kind of stuff. So it's very good.
Yeah, so if you're a fan, you like hearing about all the ins and outs, all the different ones.
I recommend it. Yeah.
All right, well, that wraps our special bonus episode of Saw X in the Saw franchise review. And we'll see you in the aisles.